Right.
Good evening, everybody.
Maybe I don't know.
And welcome to this meeting of the Planning Committee, the last one of the municipal year. We'll start again in May. Everyone's looking forward to it. I am Councillor Michael, Chair of the Planning Committee, and I'll be chairing this meeting this evening. To begin the meeting, there are a few matters of housekeeping. Action in the event of emergency. There are no practice alarms planned for this evening, so if an alarm sounds, evacuate the town hall by going down the main staircase or the back staircase to the high street and then to the car park behind the town hall in St Romwell Street. This meeting is being live streamed to the council's YouTube page and will be available after the meeting. Please would speakers use microphones at all times and speak directly into the microphone, and would participants please mute the microphones when not speaking. Introductions. Members of the committee and officers will now introduce themselves, starting from my left.
Good evening, Lynn Barton, Shrub End Ward.
Good evening, Helen Chua, St Anne's and St John's Ward.
Good evening, Councillor Sam McCarthy representing Shrub End Ward.
Evening, Chris Pearson, Labour Councillor, Beerchurch.
Martin Warnes, Councillor Beerchurch Ward.
Nigel Chapman, Rural North Ward.
Councillor Roger Mannion, Tiptree Ward.
Councillor Jackie McLean, Markstown Layer Ward.
Councillor Lee Tate for Prettygate Ward.
And good evening, Simon Cairns, Development Manager.
Robert Carmichael, Democratic Services Officer.
Thank you. Members of the committee may use electronic devices to access their meeting papers, and visitors are welcome to use mobile phones and other devices, including cameras. Please use them discreetly, set them to silent, and do not use voice or camera flash functions. We may have a break at 8 o'clock, subject to the items remaining. There are toilets on every floor in the building, and there's an induction loop in this room. Whilst determination of a planning application is not a quasi-judicial process, unlike certain licensing functions carried out by the local authority, it is a formal administrative process involving the application of national and local policies, reference to legislation and case law, as well as rules of procedure, rights of appeal, and an expectation that people will act reasonably and fairly. All involved in these decisions should remember that the possibility that an aggrieved party may seek a judicial review and or complain to the Ombudsman on grounds of maladministration or a breach of the authority's code. Item 2, substitutes. We have no substitutes for this evening. Urgent items. No urgent items for that. Declarations of interest, councillors. Councillor Tate.
I need to declare an interest that I represent Prettygate Ward.
That's not really.
Oh, right, no interest.
It's of no interest.
Oh, it's of no interest.
No, because the applications are for Lexington Ward and for
No, one of them is Prettygate.
oh, is it Prettygate Ward? Oh, sorry, I'm getting confused. I wonder why you're right and I'm wrong. Because we took all year to do it. You got there. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. And we'll come to you first. Then when it comes up, because you're the ward council for. Anybody else that I can cock up for tonight? Have your say. If anyone has a petition they wish to present to me on any items of the agenda this evening, please do so now. No. Item 6, the committee have before the minutes of the meetings for the 16th of March 2023 and the 30th of March 2023 for approval. Has anybody got any points they wish to bring up on accuracy? Are we happy for the minutes to be accepted? Agreed. Thank you very much. I'll sign them after the meeting. Then have your say. So we have 2 applications tonight. On the first one, 7.1, 230031 land between 7 and 15 Mile Away, Colchester. It's recommended for approval. Sending officer will be Chris Harden, We have a public against Simon Sorrell and a public for Robert Pomeroy. And we have councillor Roger Buston, who's joined on that one. And on 7.2, 223138 23 Reigate Street, that's recommended for approval as well. Chris Harden again to present. Public against is Maxine Rose, and public fours Keenan Karate, sorry, I hope I pronounced that right, and Mark Oucher is the visiting councillor. So we will now move on to those applications. 7.1, I'll ask Chris Harden to present the application, please.
Thank you, Chairman. So the first application is the Marlow Way application. So it's an application to vary condition 2 of the previous permission for 3 dwellings on the site. I'll just remind you of the site. So that's located here in red. The surrounding properties. And basically this is the drawing of what was previously approved and what is now built on site. So the drawings below show the heights of the dwellings in line with the neighbouring properties. But as the report indicates, essentially the neighbouring properties were shown as too high on the originally approved plans. So this application seeks to actually overcome the issue that has arisen. The plan above shows the line of the dwellings as built in relation to the neighbouring properties. You'll see the red dotted line shows them higher than the existing properties. I'll go to a slightly larger scale drawing in a second to show that a bit more clearly. So that's the street scene as built. So this shows it in more detail. Plot 1 is basically 0.715 of a metre above the ridge line of number 7 Marlow Way. So that shows the line there, the difference. And then plot 3, you'll see the difference is 0.587 above number 15. So that's the difference there. And there's also another discrepancy that came to light. Number 7 Marlow Way was shown to be a little further away from plot 1 than it really existed. There was a problem with the ordnance survey map. So that has been corrected. You'll see the dotted line there, the difference. And that's a closer view of the difference. So basically, this is a drawing of the plans that the building's now being constructed. One other discrepancy that came to light was the rear kitchens. Essentially, they were originally shown to be approximately 2.7 high on the original plans. And they've been built from ground level 3.3. So overall, you're looking at a difference in height from the originally approved plans of around about 0.7 or 0.6 in height. So that's the area in question that is higher than was originally shown. So those are the differences compared to the approved plans. This is a drawing that's been submitted showing as approved and as built. And again, that's the one showing as built on the other plots. So it's all of the plots have had the kitchens built higher than as originally approved. This is basically showing a 45-degree angle line. If you can see these green angled lines at either end of the drawings. These have been plotted to show potential impact on outlook of the neighbouring windows, and you'll see that in planned form, the scheme does not conflict with this 45-degree angle in relation to the neighbouring windows. If the rear extension had crossed that angled line, then there would have been a conflict with the policy in terms of blocking light out from neighbouring rear windows, but you'll see the extensions are well away from that line in the planned form. Similarly, the kitchens are well away from this 45-degree line in elevation form, as shown on both of the plots.
Chris, can I just stop and just clarify my point? You stated just now that that it didn't conform to the 45-degree angle, and then you went on to say that it did conform to the 45-degree angle.
I thought I said it didn't conflict.
So I thought there was a slight discrepancy, but can you confirm where the 45-degree?
I think I said it didn't conflict with the 45-degree, not conform. So So now I'll show you photographs of the dwellings as built. This is how they looked when I looked at the site a few weeks ago. They've now moved on a little bit, and we've got a couple of photographs submitted to show you, but this shows the view looking down towards the site. And a closer view of special regard to the ridge heights in relation to the neighbouring property. Trees are retained at the front. It's a closer view, again showing ridge height comparison, gaps between the property and manor at the back. Shows the gap that is retained between the properties. It's a good indication of ridge heights as well. Further back and further back still, showing the overall street scene from this angle. So looking back the other way, and this is going towards the other end of the plot. And a view looking at the comparison between the neighbouring properties. You'll see the gable is forward of this neighbouring property. It does make it look higher in the street scene, but I think that the key aspect is the ridge at the rear there, showing the comparative heights in terms of ridge heights. And that's the discrepancy in relation to what was originally anticipated. Again, another view showing a gap between the property and comparative heights. So the view looking back the other direction. It's the view looking from the rear garden, showing the gap between the neighbouring dwelling. So the view I took at the rear elevations of the properties. Note the kitchen height extensions here. This has now moved on and is grassed. Another view of the distance between properties. And this is the other end of the site, showing the gap between the neighbouring property and the kitchen extension here. And there's that gap. And then this is how the buildings have moved on in terms of glazing is in, grass is down. And the view back across the properties. And then evidence of the height of the kitchens being built higher than was approved. And now I've got some photographs that have been submitted, which have been asked to showing context from the neighbouring property. So this is the rear garden, the proximity of the dwelling as built. Again, another picture. Note windows here and on the back. Again, another view. And then this is the view of the site before it was developed. An open grassed area at the front, a wall along here and the manor to the rear. And another view before it was developed. And a later picture of the frontage. And just to remind you, the approved street scene on the original application. And approved elevations. So I'll just go back to show you the. So that was the approved street scene. Now go back to the start of the presentation. Right, so in terms of extra consultation responses, we've received 4 extra letters since the report was written. So I'll just briefly go through those. So 4 extra letters of objection. And the points they make, having looked at the committee report, are as follows. Firstly, it's pointed out that to say the difference is inconsequential is concerning. The houses are out of keeping with the character of the location. There's concern about the mustard colour on the elevations. That the committee report fails to say that the drawings were approved in good faith. That one part of the report should say plot 7 is next to number 7 Marlow Way. So in one paragraph, it says it's next to number 15. So there's a correction there, but the remainder of the report in terms of where it compares dimensions is correct. There's also concern that no pictures were shown in the report to show gaps in the street scene and how big they are or how small they are. Another point is made that the kitchens are only 2.5 metres off the boundary of the neighbouring property, and that there is concern about noise emanating from the kitchen doors and affecting neighbouring residential amenity. Also a point made that the system favours the developer and that this whole scheme makes a mockery of the planning system. There's concern about the colour of the bricks, the frames and the doors, and also finally that the scheme is overcrowded and dominant in the street scene. So now turning to planning considerations, as the report outlines, the principle of 3 dwellings has already been agreed, as has the loss of this open space. So the key issues that really now need to be considered are the differences between the current scheme and the previously approved scheme. And I've shown in detail those differences in terms of the height relationships, and it is concluded that it's still considered that the revised scheme results in a satisfactory relationship between the dwellings as built and those existing dwellings, and that the dwellings would still appear satisfactory in the street scene. It's not considered that the height variations between the new dwellings and the neighbouring dwellings are so significant as to warrant an unfavourable recommendation. Having height variations in the street scene is not unusual, and to be honest, it's pretty common. As I've said in the report, it's unfortunate that they are now shown to be higher than the neighbouring dwellings because the originally approved scheme was expected to be in line. But nevertheless, given the differences, which are not particularly significant, they are visually different, but not so different as to warrant an unfavourable decision being made, in our opinion, so that the scheme is still considered satisfactory in the environment, and hopefully the photographs showed that, but you will make your judgment on that. In terms of the difference in the relationship to number 7 and plot 1, again, because plot number 7 was shown slightly differently, then it's slightly closer to the dwelling than as anticipated, but nevertheless, that is a marginal difference. Overall, there is still a good gap between the properties as shown by my cursor here. And then the final difference in relation to the street scene is the kitchen, which is not visible from the front to any significant degree. So we'll need to consider the impact in terms of residential amenity of that issue. So turning to impact upon residential amenity, a daylight and sunlight report has been submitted, and that concludes that there's not going to be a significant impact upon the amenity of neighbouring dwellings and that the BRE standards are met. So there is not a reason to refuse the scheme in terms of the daylight and sunlight analysis. That has also been considered in relation to the rear kitchens. And again, it's considered that it meets that test. The neighbouring properties do not have side windows, so they would not be affected by the kitchen increase in height in terms of daylight and sunlight. Again, as I've shown, the 45-degree outlook is not contravened. In fact, to be honest, it's not close to being contravened. The kitchens are off the boundaries of the neighbouring properties and are of a height that is nowhere near to contravening the 45-degree rule that we use in terms of outlook and loss of light from neighbouring rear windows. So the amenity impact from that point of view is considered acceptable. So in conclusion, the scheme is considered to be visually acceptable in the street scene, and that subject to the conditions as before, which included skewer glazing on side and rear windows, then there would not be an overlooking impact in that respect or an amenity impact. So the scheme is considered to be recommended for approval. The payment required under the unilateral undertaking was paid on the previous scheme, so there's no need to now have another unilateral undertaking because the payment is already in for that. So the recommendation is for approval. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Chris. Then we move on. Sorry. Thank you, Chris. Then we move on to speakers. I have Simon Terrell, please. You have 3 minutes. The bell will go after 2 to let you know there's a minute left. The time will start when you're ready to press the red button.
Oh, good evening, committee. The first scheme proposing these 3 houses was refused by this committee in autumn 21, primarily because they would exceed the height of immediate neighbours and hence be out of character with the street scene. The second design made a point of roof lines being the same or lower than adjacent properties, as we've seen. The planning officer assured you that height was hence in conformity with the street scene, leading you to grant consent. Residents still oppose the development on the grounds of loss of open space, but the planning office convinced you otherwise. Residents at least took some comfort that the critical material planning concern for objection had been addressed, and the heights would be comparable with the rest of Marlow Way. The street scene drawing and also massing drawing clearly showed the proposed ridges at a lower height than adjacent houses. Condition number 2 of the planning decision notice explicitly required development to be carried out in accordance with these drawings. It was therefore a nasty surprise to see partway through construction, roof structures considerably higher than shown in architect's drawings. It must have been as obvious to the developer as it was to residents that this wasn't right, but building continued. The enforcement team confirmed that the council and public had been misled by the architect's drawings and agents' statements, and that a fresh planning amendment was required. At that point, any reasonable developer may have stopped building, but they carried on. The developer now admits the submitted plans were wrong, but regards the differences between what was submitted and what was built as an irrelevance. They would have you believe this was an unfortunate oversight, the misleading drawing, an artistic error. It's claimed that the roof heights exceeding that of their neighbours makes no material difference. They express regret, but the biggest regret is surely that they've been found out. Let's be clear, these actions are absolutely reprehensible. Now that the misleading nature of the application is evident, the developer is trying to backtrack. There is a clear strategy of non-compliance with the planning process and certainly no reason to grant approval because the houses are finished. Please don't let them take the council for fools. If consent is granted today, they will walk away laughing at you and it will open the door for any other developer to do the same thing. The officer maintains his unflinching bias for development regarding the error in building heights as a triviality. This flies in the face of public opinion and the importance previously given to this issue. Whilst the planning officer's actions are predictable and not in a good way, our expectation of the committee is very different. As elected officials, residents look to you to support and balance decisions, not to blindly follow officers' recommendation. Otherwise, what is the point of this committee? The fundamental reason why the first scheme was refused was that it was too high. The developer has flouted this requirement and completed the building entirely at their own risk. We urge you to stand by your original decision and force them to put this right. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyway, we have Robert Pomeroy. Same rules apply, Robert. They'll go after 2 minutes for another minute. Microphone, please.
Sorry, ready?
Start again.
Okay, I'll start again. My name is Robert Pomeroy and I'm a chartered town planner. The applicants fully acknowledge the comments made by local residents, but wish to make clear that it was not their intention to mislead anybody. The houses built are not materially taller than the approved drawings, but they are taller than that which was shown on the street scene drawing approved. This is the main issue in this case. The applicant accepts that the street scene drawing was not representative, but it was indicative and an honest mistake with no intention to deceive. There has been some criticism for suggesting that the additional height, the actual amount, is not itself important. This was said because the houses are now fully built, so there is the opportunity to judge them in their context and determine if the as-built scheme causes harm to any interest. Your officers have made their own professional planning judgment and advise you that there is no planning harm resulting from the as-built scheme. That judgment includes harm in relation to neighbouring property, lost day or sunlight, or harm to the appearance in the street. Thankfully, no demonstrable harm has been identified and all the technical and policy tests have been rigorously reapplied and all are met in full. As such, there is no planning reason why approval should not follow. The development has plainly caused some local upset. This was not deliberate. There was an unintended misrepresentation on the original plans, but that has not led to any clear harm that now needs to be rectified. 7 developments are a culture development company who employ local trades and are supplied by local merchants. They have invested a lot of money in this project and the houses are ready to sell. If permission is not granted, there will be an appeal, which will take 6 to 12 months, during which time these houses cannot be sold, revenues will be lost, and interest on borrowing needing to be paid. The houses will lie empty and will be vulnerable to antisocial behaviour. As such a delay is likely to put severe financial stress on the applicants and could result in job losses. This is, of course, their problem. It is also an unfortunate reality of the situation. However, there is no clear and obvious injury to neighbours or the street scene. I hope that members can agree that such an outcome would be disproportionately harsh in the circumstances. I therefore respectfully request members to support the officer's fully considered recommendation and allow the alterations to the approved scheme. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move on to Visiting Councillor, Councillor Roger Buston. You have 5 minutes, Roger.
Thank you. Before I start,
actually, if you're going to speak, we need to have it on the microphone, please, so it's recorded.
okay, not a problem. Before I start, Chair, could I ask, as was requested, that the before and after pictures are put on your screen on your shared screen, please. It shouldn't be a surprise. I did actually ask for this and it was approved. That would have done. Thank you. Next one, please. That one, that will do. Thank you. And the next photograph after that, because you can't have two photographs on the screen, would show it as it is now, just so that members can actually have a picture in their minds as to what has happened. And I took the photographs only a few days ago. Right, okay. Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, you've had 2 minutes.
Yes,
So are we ready to start?
thank you very much indeed.
Ready to start.
Members, officers and residents I'm instructed to represent are sadly all too familiar with this site. Mr. Chairman, may I please refer to the important observations that both you and the Vice Chair made on the 9th of March apropos the Lexton Manor site, when you both commented that what has happened on this whole site by the various developments on it have had an adverse effect, both on the area as well as on what used to be a lovely character feature property and grounds. I agree with you. Residents agree with you. It is unsupportable. The pictures show what Marlow Way used to look like before the 3 properties now erected there displaced the large Greenswald public open space. Contrast, only a few weeks ago, called in by the Vice Chair, this committee rejected again 22-2549 Highfield Drive, Lexton, essentially on grounds, and I quote from the officer's report, it was considered that the proposed development would lead to the loss of an attractive open green corner and would thus erode the feature that gives the area its townscape quality to the serious detriment of the character and appearance of the street scene and surroundings, etc., and would result in a cramped form of development that would detract from and further harm the character of the area. Earlier similar applications on that site had also been rejected by CCC. Rejections appealed, and that appeal rejected by the inspector. I'm sure you will remember it. Okay, we all know that we are instructed that there are no such things as precedent in planning. But seriously? Replacement of the large green public open space in Marlow Way by the 3 houses residents submit now clearly results in that cramped form of development that detracts from and further harms the character of the area. This development, thus, is already clearly contrary to local plan, core strategy and development, PR1 open space and DP15 retention of open space. The loss of this public amenity space is hugely significant. The officer's report here minimises the significance of a situation where developers have paid scant attention to the detail of the permission as was granted. The permission for these 3 houses has been given. We've built them and we have successfully got rid of the public open space in Marlow Way. No point in crying over milk. That all depends, I suggest, upon whose milk has been spilt. I submit that residents have every right to expect this committee to afford them both recognition as well as justice in an even-handed application of the planning rules. What is right is right. What is wrong is wrong. Planning law is not a subject where you can make it up as you go along, conjuring up convenient arguments to support a cause after deficiencies have been noted. Here it is common ground that the roof lines of those 3 houses now built have been built without consideration to the detail of the approved plans. They are higher than they should be. Whether this discrepancy be by 3 inches or 3 feet makes no difference in law, it is wrong. The previous application on this site was refused on the grounds that the roof lines proposed were above those of the adjoining properties. Here they have been so built. The point is therefore not de minimis. It is further common ground that at least one of the houses has been closer to an adjoining existing property than it should have been. Again, 3 inches or 3 feet makes no difference in law. It is again wrong. It's again not de minimis. To excuse this, submissions have now been introduced by the applicant's agent, suggesting that the definitive ordnance survey maps that we all use for planning purposes are actually to blame. Well, I've never known this argued before, and I've seen no compelling evidence that ordnance survey is defective. Nonetheless, if the plans were submitted for the applicant, the agent knowing them to be defective as is now submitted, why was this not highlighted by them at the outset? But even if it was, and even if it had been, that still does not get away from the fact that the houses could have been built both lower in roof height, as well as further away from their existing neighbours, as the permission required. Well, this didn't happen, did it? The houses were simply built, regardless, no doubt, hoping that no one would notice. Well, they have noticed. Ideally, residents would like to see this committee refuse this after the event application and instruct enforcement to require that the 3 properties be demolished and the site restored to its original state, open greensward. Residents who have had to put up with this for the last 2 or 3 years deserve no less. Alternatively, at the very least, the committee should require the roof lines of the properties to be lowered to the height specified in the permission, and the sidewall of the property as has been built too close to its neighbour, rebuilt to the line specified. Given the particular history of this site, I cannot imagine that either of the above suggestions would not be upheld on appeal by an inspector. This evening, this committee has a unique and unexpected opportunity, an opportunity created only by the inattentions of the developers themselves in not following the approved plans, in effect to reverse the earlier decision, which you, as chairman and vice chair, quite correctly made plain only last month should never have been made. Otherwise, gentlemen, ladies, as has been suggested earlier, why are we here? I've sat as a councillor on both sides of the planning committee process fence, both where you are sitting now in judgment and where I am sitting now as a supplicant. Solomon's had an easy job in comparison. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any points that you wish to take up? I have to say that we wouldn't be here tonight if the developer had done his job properly and built them as they should have done. And it's a worry that we are here tonight and talking about this again, to be honest. And the question that we have, we consider precedent for the rest of all our planning meetings in doing that and what we decide tonight. Some of us did a site visit today, and I thought the houses looked quite nice. Good use of the space down there. It was fine. Each to their own, I believe. Other members have done individual ones, so we are aware of the site there. But if only the developer had done his job properly, none of us would be here tonight. Just want to say that. And it has to be said, really, that we're not going to be made fools of as council. We will make a decision tonight, whether you like it or not, but there we are. So over to Chris. Any points you wish to raise, Chris? I have to say that in some areas I've known of antisocial behaviour, the one I saw today was not one that leads to a lot of antisocial behaviour in that area. Quite nice, pleasant area on that. So, Chris, over to you.
Now, thank you, Chairman. Just a few points. Yes, the original was shown to be lower or in line with the neighbouring properties, and that is a fact, as I showed you from the drawings. It did result in a loss of open space at the time, but that was carefully looked at by committee, even on the original refusal, which it was concluded that the loss of the open space and replaced with dwellings was acceptable, but that the original scheme was too high. So then it was revised and considered acceptable on the previous approval. Yes, it doesn't accord with condition 2 of the approved drawings, which is why we've got this application in. And it is fair to say that the drawings did result in the committee being misled. To be honest, it's not the first time this has happened on schemes that I've dealt with in the last 35 years, basically. Unfortunately, it does happen. Some things are misplotted. And when they are, then we have to look to assess whether you take action to remedy the situation, which can be getting a new application in as we've got, and then consider it on its merits. Sometimes it's deemed that it's too far beyond what was approved, and enforcement action to remove certain elements is put forward. In this case, it's considered that the scheme still looks acceptable in the street scene, and it's not considered there should be enforcement action. But again, that's a judgment that the councillors can make. My recommendation is that is acceptable at this stage. You can be assured there's no bias from myself and from the officers involved. It's judged strictly on its planning merits. If we considered that it was not acceptable in the street scene, we can take enforcement action. In this case, demolishing the 3 dwellings, I think would be completely excessive, to be honest, because we've agreed the principle. The action you'd have to take would be potentially to lower the roofs and make the actual gables shallower, which would probably not look visually acceptable. Certainly the difference has not been treated as a triviality. A great deal of time has been spent on getting the plans in, looking at the site, preparing the report, discussing it at team meetings, etc. So, you know, it is considered in great depth and a lot of time has been put in to reaching the recommendation. Then Councillor Buston's comments. Again, the open space issue was considered at the time, and that the loss of it was deemed acceptable to committee. References made to the other sites at Highfield Drive, which I'm very familiar with, which I did refuse myself, and then another colleague took it over and refused it as well. On the Highfield Drive site, there was a long history of appeal refusals. That is a different site. It is on a corner. It's not an infill plot. Each site is different, as Councillor Buston has concluded. But again, that site was deemed different in terms of it kept an open space on a corner plot. The inspectorate deemed that our refusal was justified in that case. Just finally, the comments, the differences do need to be considered. Councillor Buston has made the point that in law it's either right or wrong. Well, in terms of planning considerations, there is a difference and you have to make a judgment. Is that difference so far wrong to warrant enforcement action, or is it acceptable visually in the street scene? Yes, it was the developer that did the surveys wrong. I don't believe they did that intentionally. And then I think finally, as I said, demolishing the 3 properties, I think is excessive, and I frankly cannot see an inspector actually backing that type of enforcement if that was put forward. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Councillor Tate, please.
Thank you. So my position is this: when does a street, when does the difference, when does that become significant? If it's as Councillor Buston said, it's either right or it's wrong. If we're saying, oh, there's a cut-off point, well, what's that cut-off point? To me, 0.71 of a metre being about that big is a substantial difference. It's not, we're not talking 3 centimetres, we're talking a big difference. My main concern, however, forgetting the fact that, this was a disputed site, but planning was agreed, but it was agreed with very specific conditions attached to it, and they've not been upheld. And that, in my mind, is wrong. And it's wider than this. If we, every time they don't match the plan, say, oh, well, all right, then it's a bit of an inconvenience to put it right. What does that say for us as a committee, for future planning applications? As you said, Chair, it's the precedent it sets. And this, as I say, in my opinion, isn't insignificant. It's a big difference. Putting personal taste aside, and they're most certainly not to my taste, seeing the picture of the finished articles, there's a clear difference, and it's not what was promised to the residents, not what we agreed. And in my view, that's wrong.
Thank you. I think that some of the decisions we are here tonight to make is not to do with the site and going back on that old grounds, because the houses were given permission to be built, but they were given conditions to be built in. I mean, residents didn't like that, but now it has been built too high. That is what we will have to decide tonight. And I think there's 3 decisions to be made. We either make one where they take down the ridge and move it back to the original plans. Or whether you want to demolish all three houses, but they'll be rebuilt to the specs of what they were before. And they'll probably go to the planning inspector and they'll cost us thousands to decide. Or we decided to go and acceptable. So that's where we are. It's not about the plot of the land or anything like that. It's just those decisions only. Chris, anything you want to pick up from, I think that from Councillor Tate? And then we'll have Simon come in.
Yeah, I'll just pick up a couple of points. Yes, the difference is not insignificant. That's why we got a planning application in. Certainly, we would normally deem a 0.3 difference on site in terms of positioning or possible heights as de minimis, because that does happen on sites, minor discrepancies. But if you get beyond 0.3, then that's certainly not insignificant, which is why we've got a planning application in to consider that difference. The condition it doesn't comply with is the drawings, as we've explained, and it doesn't match the plans, which again is why we've got the revised scheme for consideration. And it's not what is promised, but nevertheless, you have to make a judgment. Is the resulting scheme acceptable in the street scene? And our opinion is that, it is acceptable in the street scene for the reasons I've explained. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Before you step in, Simon, can I ask if we make a decision here tonight to accept the application as it is and accept the extra height, would that set a precedent for any other developer who coming in here and build it deliberately or not? Could I have your answer on that one? That easy question. Simon.
Thank you, Chair. No, as we've explained previously, and I think as Councillor Buston correctly identified, planning doesn't work on principles of precedent as other forms of law would. As you correctly pointed out at the beginning, we do not carry out a quasi-judicial function here. Each planning application is considered on its specific merits, and that is what you have to do this evening. Councillor Tate raised the really important question of when is the difference significant? And I think I would go further to say when a difference is significant, when it gives rise to material harm. We've heard a lot about the fact that there are differences in height, and that is a question of fact. Clearly, there is a difference in height between the approved scheme and that is built. But what we haven't heard, other than it looks different, is that nobody has actually identified what the harm is that results from that difference. So if it was a very significant increase in height, say 2 or 3 meters, it would look visually incongruous. But we are talking of quite a small relative difference in the ridge heights. And the question I think you need to ask yourselves is, does that look visually discordant in the street scene? Would the passerby on the Clapham omnibus even tell the difference? If it is different, then what is the harm that results? And that is, I think, what you have to look to identify. Material harm, because simply because the scheme is different doesn't in itself warrant refusal. It has to be around material harm that has to flow and therefore conflict with your development plan policies. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor McLean.
Thank you, Chair. I find this so disappointing. We sit on this committee, we give our view, we're asked to, with the recommendations from the officers, we're told it will be this. How did this break down? Was it the inspectors or was it the site visits, from the officers? I mean, how has this happened? I mean, it's 24 centimetres off being a metre, too high. That's a significant amount, and it definitely ruins the street scene of that street. I'm sorry, they are so imposing and they are so vastly different. If they'd been smaller, they would have been more acceptable. Now, there's right and wrong. The developer, I mean, where's the breakdown? They knew what they had the permission for. They've got official people on site to help them read the plans, get it right. So what has gone wrong? Or have they just taken the mickey out of us and actually just gone ahead with it? Because it's so infuriating to see how this has happened when on every development or any site, you actually have strict rules and regulations to abide by. I just find it so disappointing for all of us because we spent a lot of time going over this to try and get the right plans for the local residents who absolutely opposed it 100%. Now, we did a job as councillors to make sure it was something acceptable for them. So something has broken down in the system. And where has this happened? Because that is nearly a metre too high. And that is a significant amount in my book, I'm afraid. So I'd like to know how that happened.
I believe that we don't send inspectors round on houses that are being built to check they're being built correctly, do we? How is the process that we deal with things like this, Chris?
Thank you, Chairman. Well, it's not really the issue of them not being built correctly. The issue is that the street scene drawings were plotted incorrectly in terms of the neighbouring dwellings. So I think what has happened is, as the developer has said, that the drawings in terms of the measuring the heights of the neighbouring properties, they were not measured accurately, were not as accurately as they should have been, which has caused the discrepancy basically. So that's what has happened. It's the neighbouring properties shown incorrectly on the street scene elevations. The differences being 0.5 and 0.7, which, as we said, it's not insignificant, but nevertheless, you've got officers' views about the impact on the street scene and Simon's views about harm. You know, where is the harm in terms of the overall visual impact? Hopefully, you know, everyone has looked at the site and the photographs and has made that judgment. So yes, that's my point on that, Chairman.
Okay, go back to Councillor McLean.
The harm, I think, is the property behind these houses, how it's been obliterated, and it's just a fraction on the top of the roof line you see of it. Whereas really, that's a substantial house that's been there for so many years, and it was all incorporated into the scene of these houses. The whole point was having it lower so you could see back, just get the street scene and have not so imposing. So in my book, that's the harm.
Okay, I've got a couple more councillors. I'll come back to you, Councillor Day. Councillor Pearson.
Thank you, Chair. I think I have more questions than comments, really, but I'll make one or two comments before I start with the questions. One, it's been suggested that in law, you've either got right or wrong, but we just need to be mindful that English law is not that cut and dried. So we have a decision to make this evening, whether a right or wrong decision. Nevertheless, we have a decision to make this evening. I had a question about how the height differences have occurred. I think I've heard what the answers are to that, but I'd just like confirmation and clarification. Do we have building regs officers visiting sites any longer? If not, then we have, yeah. So there's nothing any longer to check that. I am concerned that this committee agreed to the application on the sole grounds that the height levels were as described in the conditions. And that's obviously been flouted. Now, we heard from the builder's representative that that wasn't done with malice. However, I was very concerned to hear some of the comments and remarks that were made about the impact of us turning down the officer's recommendation this evening. And I think that was unfortunate that those remarks were made this evening. I won't use the term blackmail, but I was feeling very uncomfortable.
I will.
I'd like to ask Mr. Keynes what the test for demonstrable harm would be. And I hear what everyone's saying about significant or insignificant, and I think this is where, you know, one person's significant, maybe another person's insignificant. And I think I was roughly trying to work out the difference in height is probably about there, right? Now, I might consider that to be fairly insignificant, but someone else might consider that to be quite significant. And given that we only passed the application on the basis that those heights were as said, I think I would be very concerned this evening for us not to find some way to enforce that height restriction on the roof. I think taking the buildings down is extreme, but I would like to ask our officers whether how significant it would be to the builder to actually change the existing height and to ensure that the height of the roof was in line with the original condition.
Shall we go over to Simon for that point?
Yeah.
Yep. Simon, please.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, responding to those points, with regard to the difficulty or complexity of returning the scheme to full compliance, I think we would have to seek a deferral and refer it back to them for further dialogue on the feasibility of achieving that and how great a task it actually is. Obviously, it depends on a number of construction issues that we aren't really party to. With regard to the matter of checking development on site, I'm not aware as to whether this is a council, local authority building control service reviewed scheme or whether an approved inspector actually dealt with the building regs. In the past, before the market for building regulation approval was liberalised, there only was one service provider, and it was very much simpler situation, and we could have answered that question, but we can't in this instance. We do not have resource to uniformly go out and check compliance of schemes on site. As you'll appreciate, there are many hundreds of dwellings built every year in Colchester, and we rely on the neighbours to notify us when they see something going awry, and generally they do so. So it's a very good test, really, as to whether there is a change that is material in the context. So that's very helpful. With regard to the materiality of that difference in height, I do appreciate that the uniformity of height was seen as a material matter in the members' consideration of the original consent. However, the question, I think, for you to reconsider is whether there is an absolute planning need for ridges to be uniform. With regard to whether the difference in uniformity is so materially discordant in the street to give rise to visual harm. In addition, there is a sunlight and daylight test being carried out, which demonstrates that the differences between the two schemes are not material, having regards to the adopted test for that. So it would seem a visual matter, one of street scene character. We're not dealing with a conservation area. That isn't to say that there isn't a degree of sensitivity, but there isn't the heightened degree of aesthetic sensitivity. Were you dealing with a highly composed and highly designed street scene? Now, this is obviously a very typical suburban development of its time. I think it is more a question of reality rather than by design that the ridges are uniform. It's equally possible to say that uniform ridges can be monotonous. There are obviously two views to everything. But the question for you is identifying whether the harm is material and whether it justifies retrospective amendment to those dwellings. If members are so opined that it is, then I suggest that you instruct us to return to the applicant and seek further information on what could be done to ameliorate that, whether that's in whole or in part, and whether they would be willing so to do that, because that would obviously avoid further appeals and all the rest of it. But that is obviously at your discretion, members, to consider whether you wish to pursue that option. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Can
I'll
I-
go back to Councillor Pearson.
If I just finish, then thank you. So in terms of remedies, I think you've pointed out that we have very few in terms of what we can suggest, but the final question I had was around the unilateral undertaking, and I know in Mr. Harden's recommendation it refers to consideration of a new unilateral undertaking, but then I think in your remarks, Mr. Harden, you were suggesting that there wasn't any need for a further or any suggestion for a further unilateral undertaking. So I think that probably brings us back to your remarks just then, Mr. Cairns, about what we might want and whether or not we want to defer for further consultation, discussion, negotiation with the builder. I think that's all I have for now, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Mannion, then I'll come back to you, Councillor Tate.
Thank you, Chair. I am uneasy about this whole situation. I don't agree with Mr. Hayden's opinion regarding the way that this happened. Let's be fair, ridge height equates to roof angle, which affects street scene. The more acute the angle is and the higher that roof is, that will definitely equate to a street scene which is uncomfortable. And that is exactly what we see. The ridge height is high, but the angle of the roof is low. When the roof trusses were laid by the builder, he could obviously see that the roof was going to exceed the designed requirements, the approved drawings. And yet, having seen the error, he didn't do anything about it. At that point, the roof trusses could have been taken down at the very first building, the very first site building. When the first roof trusses go up, you could see that they are higher. The apex is higher than the surrounding building. So there could have been corrective action done at that time. There wasn't. So that means in some respects that I see that this guy is taking the mickey of this committee, and I object to that strongly. So I find it definitely not a good thing, and it's going to make this committee's work a bit of a mockery. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thank you. You have to be clear that the builder was working for the plans exactly to the plans that he had, but the plans were wrong. Am I correct in that assumption? No, the drawings. What's the clarity of that?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I think the point that Chris has explained is that the elevations as built are as per the approved scheme. It is the neighbouring houses that are shown at the wrong height. So they have built what they have approval for in terms of the approved elevations. It's the actual relative height of the existing development versus the approval that is incorrect by virtue of the incorrect street scene elevation, which shows all the buildings in a row. The individual elevations of the houses as approved in isolation. So if you cut away the neighbouring properties, they are built at the right height with regard to the ridge, apart from the kitchens, which are in all circumstances built higher. Does that clarify, Councillor Mannion?
Can I just ask who was responsible for measuring the height then of the neighbouring properties? Wasn't that the designer?
Those drawings were submitted by the applicant collateral to the application and did form part of condition 2 on the decision notice as an approved drawing, reflecting the fact that members found the relative heights of the approved development with that existing to be significant in their opinion.
Can I get, sorry, I'm sorry, Mr. Carniford, just to come back to that. Are you saying that the original drawings as presented to this committee, including the original properties alongside this development, those drawings showed that they were in equal height to the proposed development? Is that what you're saying? And if so, why were those drawings incorrect?
There are two elements, sorry, Councillor Mannion. There is the individual elevational drawings of the development, which are correct, as built. What is not correct is the relative heights of that development to the neighbouring properties. The neighbouring properties are shown as being too tall in the street scene, approved street scene elevations.
Sorry, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. How did that occur? I mean, how did we get into that situation? I just don't understand. I'm sorry. I mean, I may be a bit stupid, but I don't understand how drawings could have been, the wrong drawings could have been approved. I'm sorry.
I think we weren't there, so that's a question for other people to talk about. I'm going to have to move on a bit. Yeah, I've got you down, Martin. Councillor Chapman. Sorry, Councillor Tate, and then Councillor Chapman.
Thank you. So I've got two concerns from further discussion. So taking into account that the plans were wrong, or not the plans, the drawings of the neighbouring properties were wrong, that doesn't explain why they have built kitchens, you know, at a different height. There's no, so that would, to me, make me think that there's a bit of a disregard for following plans. Now, I'm going to sort of follow on from what Councillor Mannion has said. Okay, they're building it to the agreed plan. However, once the, as he correctly states, once the roof's gone up, they could see it was taller. Why did they carry on building? You know, as soon as it was disputed, and we've come back to here, why did it not stop awaiting the outcome of this planning? You know, that the fact that it's completed is because they chose to continue building, assuming that this would just be a yeah, they can, we'll grant permission. And I think the onus on that falls on the developer, not on us as a committee.
I think you'll find that they thought they were correct in what they were doing. To be honest, they didn't know what they'd done wrong until the neighbours pointed out, and here we are tonight.
And then why is the kitchen higher?
That's a different one. Councillor Chapman, please.
Thank you, Chairman. This is all very unfortunate, really, isn't it? And I share that with great sympathy with what's been said before. I mean, clearly the committee made a decision on what they wanted for this site, and in fact, I'm pretty convinced that the builder built what they thought was correct. Actually, I'm sure nobody on site had been to the committee meeting when they had the debate about you know, the relative height of the roofs and that sort of thing. So if they built what they were given to build, that was right. Nobody spotted the fact that they should have been lower compared to the neighbouring site houses. And I can't see why they would want to make such a minor difference deliberately anyway. I can't see why that would be what they've gained by doing that. So I'm fairly, I can't quite see. It's an error that's been made. That's what I think. I do accept that, and I can't quite see why anybody would make such a small mistake for no real purpose. So I'm conflicted here. I understand that people want to get what we agreed should be done. But if there's a deliberate mistake, that's quite right. But I cannot see anything about that was deliberate. I'm not convinced really either by the argument that it upsets the street scene anyway. I mean, we went on the site visit this afternoon, and it wouldn't look any different if it was that much shorter. I don't think really into the whole street scene. It's very difficult to argue that point. So two things really bother me. I cannot see what the problem is with it as it is, other than that it is not what we wanted. But what harm it's doing to anybody. And what benefits doing to anybody else, I don't see. So I'm in a conflict here, Chairman. No, I haven't quite made up my mind what I want to do on this.
I think we're all in a conflict, to be honest, after more jobbing. Simon, do you want to come in, or we'll go for Simon and then Councillor Warren?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I do understand members' dissatisfaction at this situation, and I'm sure that the applicants do as well. It is extremely common, in my experience, to varying degrees for development not to be undertaken strictly in accordance with the approvals. It is not an unusual occurrence. When developers are on site, there are all sorts of things that change, including the slab height, the finished floor level. All sorts of things do subtly change and do result in differences with the approved scheme. I appreciate that in this instance, the ridge was a matter that was given particular consideration by this committee. That is a fact. In this instance, Councillor Tate raised the whole point of whether the kitchens were why they were not built at the correct height. They have been built taller. Undoubtedly, they have been built taller, but as Mr. Harden demonstrated by the 45-degree test, they have no material, no impact whatsoever on the amenity of neighbouring properties. So in terms of having an expediency case for us to take action, there would be no public interest because they have no impact in terms of the kitchens. With regard to the street scene, your officers have advised you in their opinion that the difference is not, it's not that it's not material, because clearly we wouldn't have an application before us. Nobody is arguing it's de minimis, as Councillor Buston identified. We would not have an application before us if that were the case. We do have an application before us, so that acknowledges that there is a material difference in height. But the question for members to consider is, as a result of that height, is there identifiable harm to interests of acknowledged importance? And that, I think, is for members to consider. You have two options, obviously, to consider to approve the scheme as now shown, or to seek amendments to that scheme. That is clearly for you to decide. Thank you.
Councillor Warren.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's been established here that the buildings were built as were shown on the plan. It's just that the existing buildings were misrepresented in whatever way. And so when the buildings were built as approved, they ended up being higher than the ridges of the neighbouring properties, which went against what was expressed at the meeting, that the committee members that approved the original plans wanted to see the ridge heights the same. But we're in this situation because the drawings were wrong, not that the buildings were built to the wrong height. So for me, it's about what's to be gained out of refusing this application, or even trying to actually amend it when it seems like the buildings were built as they should have been. And therefore the significance of the difference and the harm that causes, you do have to think about what differences in roof heights there are within the surrounding neighbourhood. And if you walk further down Marlow, you can see that there are differing ridge heights. And if you go on to the neighbouring roads, there's also differing ridge heights as well. So it's not as if the area is built to a conformity of ridge heights, because it's not. So I'm conflicted because, like everyone else, I'm disappointed that a professional developer has presented plans that are so obviously wrong, and we as members are dependent upon the plans presented to us. There's no legal requirement for us to go and measure the existing buildings. We are taking in good faith what has been presented to us, and they're clearly wrong. But I think others have pointed out that that would have been apparent when you got to the roof base plate of the first building. And why then did the builder not stop building, recognise the mistake, come to the council and talked about where to go forward from them? But if I've understood what's happened is the building continued, neighbouring residents raised the alarm, the council got involved, saw there was that was beyond a minor difference that required another application, and we are where we are. So for me, if I'm going to support a deferral, it's not only about what is the scope of further negotiations with the developer, who frankly should have realised the mistake once you got up to the roof base plate of the first building, which has clearly been sort of pointed out. It's common sense that there would have been a discrepancy between the drawing that has been presented and how the properties are then going to look. But for us, if we're going to seek to actually negotiate those sort of differentials, the key question that I think the officers need to answer is, if we were to refuse this application, could we defend that at appeal? Because ultimately that is the bottom line. If you turn it down and the developer appeals, is there a defendable case? And that is my understanding of what the drop procedure is all about. So for me to be able to decide whether I would support a deferral in the hope that further negotiations might bring changes, which, as I pointed out, could have come about if stopping at the roof plate on the first building had in fact happened, I'd want to know whether we could defend a refusal if it came to appeal. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Barton, please.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, I do agree with Councillor Chapman. I don't think there's any deliberate intention by the bill to deceive and build incorrectly, because there's no purpose in that. Can't see what he would gain from it. I have said it before, and it's been mentioned by Councillor Buston. I do agree that this whole site's been overdeveloped over the years, but with respect, that damage has now been done and can't be turned back. I mean, it's horrendous, the amount of buildings that have gone on that original site. It's a real shame. But last night I did drive, took a friend to have a look down Marlow Way, because I hadn't been since it was a grass area, to see what the houses look like. I will say that I didn't like the design of the houses at all. They hit you in the face when you went along the street, because I'm not used to them being there. Didn't like the design of those. But I do have to say, I did not notice that the roof height significantly impacted on the street scene, and neither did my friend. And if we hadn't been specifically going for that purpose, I wouldn't have even noticed it. But I do appreciate that a lot of the committee aren't happy with this. So I'm going to suggest that perhaps it would be a good idea to defer this at this point, so that we can, well, the planning department can have the discussions with the developer to see if we can come to some arrangement of any description. But it is a very tough one, and I do appreciate that residents aren't happy with this. But that would be my proposal, actually, that we defer this. But I'd like to hear what Mr. Cairns thinks about that. Thank you.
Oh, well, actually, there is a procedure that we have to follow for when we're going against an officer's recommendation, and that is deferral on this. The councillor warns, he first proposed the deferral, so I looked at him, says happy. So what we have to do now to defer it, we turn to officers, they'll tell you the implications on what they are when we defer it. We will then need to identify why we're referring it. Do we need more information about the development and about the way things are done? So we have to give reasons for the deferral. We can't just say we're going to defer it. what are the risks for us? Do you need to defer it because we need more information from the developer and from the agents and from officers? And even, as you mentioned, look into what the planning inspector recommendations and said before. Simon, over to you for the rest.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I think there's the recommendation isn't strictly being overturned. You're not recommending refusal at this point. You're recommending a deferral for negotiations. Obviously, the only risk inherent to that would be if the applicant decided to appeal against non-determination. I don't think that would actually get them anywhere at all at this stage. And I do think that it would help members to have that additional information with regard to what is possible, with regard to retro alterations to reduce potentially the ridge height and what could be achieved, because I'm sure there are variants of that with regard to whether it could be back to the approved scheme or back to something that members may find less material. So that would be a perfectly reasonable outcome. I think if you wish to defer the application for discussions with the applicants to look to clarify the potential available options for a reduction in the ridge height of the dwellings as built in relation to the adjacent neighbouring dwellings. Thank you, Chair. Hope that's clear.
Thank Chris. No, sorry, James, just a very quick point. I think if we defer it, I think we need to be clear about what we're sort of asking for. For example, if we negotiated with the developer to say, can you reduce it a bit, but it's still a little above the ridge height of the neighbours, is that acceptable? Or are we saying it needs to be in line? There's no point in amending it if it's not going to be in line. I think that's probably the clear thing, because what we don't want to do is they suggest us amending it a little bit and it's a little bit higher than the neighbouring, but still not the same. So it probably need to be fairly clear on that. Otherwise we'll be, you know, doing the same thing again in 3 weeks' time. So probably clear.
Yeah, I can see where you're coming from, but if we're asking them to reduce it a little bit, it would need to go back to what it was. So therefore we can make that decision here tonight without the deferral. I think what we're looking for is whether something can be done that does reduce it to the other way, and then if it can be done, then we come back in a report back to the committee of that. Martin, you proposed it. Are you happy with the wording of?
Chair, it was actually Councillor Pearson that actually recommended. I was saying what I thought I needed in order to support a deferral.
Okay, and Councillor Barton, you were happy with your recommendations, weren't you?
I am, but do ask Chris.
So Chris.
Yeah, Chair. So thank you. And I think the clarification from Mr. Keynes and Mr. Harden helps us there. I would suggest we defer so that officers can discuss with the developer whether it's feasible to reduce the height to the original condition or what is feasible somewhere in between the existing height and the height in the conditions, and that then be brought back to committee to determine.
That's all.
Yeah, I just need clarification on what Chris is asking. If I followed the debate properly, then the buildings were built to the height shown on the plans. It was just that the representation of the existing properties was incorrect. So when Councillor Pearson is saying, can they lower the height? Well, they built it to the height that was approved.
No, they weren't, but we can, I'll leave Simon to.
I think it'll go over to Simon and we'll go for a decision then on Simon.
Thank you, Chair. I think the point that we're all searching for is the relative height to the neighbouring properties is as was depicted in the original scheme, insofar as is possible. Thank you.
Okay, so now we're going to go to the vote. And the vote is for councillor Barton seconded and councillor Vaughan's proposed it. So councillor Pearson proposed it. So we now have a vote on deferral as per the recommendations that we just set out by councillor Pearson. Go for that. So all those in favour of the deferral with those recommendations, please.
Yeah.
Yes, please show.
This is unanimous, Chair.
Thank you, and that concludes that very complicated issue on that. We'll take a break for 5 minutes and then we'll be back in, or 5 to 10 if you want. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Now we move on now to our next application, which is the Reigate Street one. 7.2. And it's recommended for approval, and we'll pass over to Chris to do the report, please, Chris.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll just get the presentation up. Go through that again. Okay, so this is an application at 23 Reigate House. It's a change of use from the Probation Services offices to create managed HMO rooms. Just to clarify, there will be 28 HMOs in, sorry, 27, not 28, 27. So this is the red line site here. Note proximity to Castle Park, which is just further down here to the right on the screen. This is the existing site layout. It's got 2 trees at the front of the site, 2 smaller trees to the rear. Got parking as exists here, if you can see my cursor there. And basically this is existing building as it was the probation office. Lots of offices internally there. And similarly existing. Now this is the proposed layout as such. Still going to have 3 car parking spaces here. The parking that was originally shown in this area here on this scheme has been negotiated out because it potentially would have affected the tree. So there will be a total of 3 parking spaces. We've got cycle store going in here and the bin store going in there. There's minor alterations to the fenestration just here to achieve that. This shows the layout of the property. So it's a ground floor plan. The minor fenestration changes are just located just here. And then this is the first floor plan. Probably can't take all that in, but you can refer back to it if necessary. And then the second floor plan. And this is just details of a previous application that was approved for flats on the site. It was a notification for 14 self-contained flats, which was approved in 2015, as referred to in the committee report. So same site, and these were the flats. So it was a prior approval with no conditions, essentially. These are pictures of the site at present. So the use has clearly ceased. So that's the front of the site there. Trees that are to be retained in the parking area there. That's a view the other direction. And that's a front-on view of the site. So in terms of the planning considerations, the proposal lies within the city limits. So it's a sustainable location, and the HMO scheme will therefore be judged on its planning merits. To that effect, you'll note from the report that the scheme meets the HMO standards in terms of room sizes and provision of facilities. It will also be covered by an HMO license that is required. The 3 spaces at the front of the site have raised no objections from the Highway Authority. They're happy with the number of spaces. It is in a very sustainable location within easy walking distance of the city centre and a number of other transport options. So the extent of parking provision is considered acceptable. You'll need to bear in mind that 14 flats did get a prior approval on the site previously, so the principle of residential has been established on the site. You should also note that the former office use would have actually warranted several parking spaces on site and there had only been 3. So there would have been demand for parking from the office use, which is obviously the 3 stories. So one question you have to ask is, would the HMOs actually deem that you require more parking spaces than an office? And in our view, they wouldn't. Just to note that it's been confirmed there will not be parking permits available to the residents of the HMOs. That's been confirmed by the relevant organisation. You'll note that the amenity spaces are pretty small, but there's certainly no room really to increase amenity spaces on site. But Castle Park is approximately 100 yards from this site, so there's plenty of amenity area for the residents to enjoy if they want to leave the HMOs and wander out into a lighter open space. So in terms of amenity provision, that is considered acceptable overall in this context and in this town centre location. As I've said before, there'll be minimal external alterations, so it's not considered there'll be an impact on the character of the street scene in terms of those alterations. It's not considered there'll be a detriment to neighbouring residential amenity. The windows are already there, so it's difficult to argue there's going to be any extra overlooking. The windows face the front of properties in the street, and the front of neighbouring properties is not normally a private area anyway. This would not result in any overlooking of private amenity spaces. So it's not considered there'll be a detriment to neighbouring residential amenity from this use. Antisocial behaviour would not be a reason in planning terms to refuse this application. That's not an issue as to how the people behave within the HMOs. There's no evidence to indicate that there'll be any more antisocial behaviour in HMOs than in dwellings, in effect. In addition, the trees are not going to be affected. The parking has been removed from under the trees, so they will be retained. So we're therefore going for a recommendation of approval subject to the completion of the unilateral undertaking to secure the contributions. One point in relation to contamination, potential asbestos in the building, we would like authority to consider applying an informative or a condition to cover that, to make sure that any asbestos is removed satisfactorily. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Chris. We move on to the speakers now. Can I call upon Maxine Rose, please? Maxine, you have 3 minutes to speak. The bell go after 2, then you know there's 1 minute to go. The time will start when you start.
We object to the planning permission for Reigate House. Your quote, approximately 40 objections have been received. The number actually exceeds 60. I hope you've read all of them. The concerns are parking, safety, detrimental to the area and park, unsuitable for the historical nature of the Dutch Quarter, antisocial behaviour. The HMO will attract noise, littering, vandalism, drug taking, criminal activity and potential violence. Your quote, there is no evidence that a managed HMO would give rise to antisocial behaviour. Considerable evidence exists in this city and others across the country. It is disingenuous and wrong to dismiss residents' concerns in this way. It is well documented that HMOs have a devastatingly negative effect on an area. Many of the inhabitants will be former criminals, recovering addicts and itinerants with no stake in the community. If you don't have an investment in where you live, be it financial, social or emotional, you don't treat it with respect. Your quote, the HMO will be subject to management and licensing, giving reassurance that use is compatible with location. The plans show a manager's store, no office, no capacity for manager on site 24/7. Remote management will be unable to mitigate antisocial behaviour. Unconsidered facts. Community experience of the former probation office was ambulance and police visits dealing with clients under the influence of drink and drugs frequently, Monday to Friday in office hours. This proposal is for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no infrastructure to mitigate disturbance. Your quote, if any noise nuisance were to occur, there are effective remedies through environmental protection and policing, so the community and emergency services will mop up this. Statement, the Highway Authority have raised no objections on parking. The authority does not have the lived experience of the many residents who have already reported inadequate parking provision. Recent planning position rejecting a 46-bed HMO at Trippier House, Colchester. Quote, the proposal creates a harmful intensification of use that would not be compatible with the neighbouring residential areas, and it's considered harmful noise and disturbance impacts the neighbouring properties. Ditto Reigate House. With over 60 objections to this application, if you go ahead with this, it will indicate that this council sees developer wishes as more important than residents. We deserve the right, as you do, to live safely within our homes, neighbourhoods and communities. If this goes ahead, that right will be taken away. We urge you to reject this application. The word acceptable has been said around this table a lot this evening. Things are only acceptable if they don't affect you. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, public for Keenan, please. And same for you. We have 3 minutes. The bell go after 2. Give an extra 1. And we'll start when you start.
Good evening, madam, and good evening, sirs. My name is Kenan Karatay, and I am a local businessman, which I have lived in Colchester over 30 years and raised 3 kids in Colchester, which I love Colchester so much. I would never do anything to hurt the neighboring area or the city. I live 5 minutes away from Riverside. I live in Riverside, like 5 minutes away from St. Peter's Street. And I will make sure I will run the property professionally and properly with my son here. He will be helping me. I have run shops in Colchester in the last 30 years, working the nighttime economy, helping to contribute to the nighttime economy. So I am a hard worker. And in the last 10 years, I have managed to get myself onto property, which I like very much. And I have got similar properties, 2 of them, like the HMOs, one in Bank Passage and one in Queen Street, which I run pretty well. And also, I never get any problems there. And every other day I get a phone call. Do you have a room? Do you have a 1-bedroom flat? Do you have a studio to rent? As I believe Colchester is a very, very nice city that people will be coming here to live. So demand is there for this kind of projects. And this building has been here for over 8 years unoccupied. And when I bought it over a year ago, around the building was so much rubbish around it. Since then, we cleaned it up, and it's already a nice building at this minute. It's already, so without being in there. With parking, we are purchasing additional parking from Stewart House across the road. So that we will have more parking spaces for the building, and I believe the numbers are not important if you run the project professionally, and it will also, I believe, help the economy as well. That's it, really. Thank you very much. I appreciate your approval, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Could you turn the microphone off, please? Thank you. And now, Councillor Mark Gocher, please. As the one ward councillors. As usual, Mark, you have 5 minutes. The bell will go after 4.
Thank you, Chair. It's an area of the city I know quite well, and I know that you know it well yourself. And I think we need to put it into context. My concerns are partly about antisocial behaviour and the effect on the area. And I think the concerns of a lot of people are here because we all know that in that part of town there are other establishments which are HMOs or multiple occupation buildings where there have been significant problems. Particularly, there's one that springs to mind on North Station Road, and what I would like to know is exactly how is this a proposed HMO in Reigate House going to be managed? Will there be somebody there in the daytime as well as the nighttime? Without trying to suggest what might happen, how is it going to be effectively managed 24 hours a day? Because that is what a lot of people say is wrong with the other establishments that spring to mind. I don't want to name specific places, but I'm sure you know, some people would know what I'm talking about. But basically, I'm also concerned about the occupants of the new HMO. It does seem that it's quite high density. We've gone from 14 apartments to 27 dwellings, and they've got shared kitchens. It seems crammed in. And my concern is also about the quality of the accommodation that we are offering. You know, the residents of the development are people. They and are they being crammed in like sardines? With shared accommodation, it seems to me, it reminds me of my old student days. You know, and while I was okay with that when I was 18 to 21, would I want to live in that accommodation at the moment? I'm also concerned about the parking. We all know that there are pressures on parking in that area of the city. And if you've got 27 dwellings with only 3 parking spaces, where is the rest of the parking going to go? So I'd like to know, I suppose a question I have is, if there are negotiations with Stuart House, exactly how far have those negotiations gone, and how many parking spaces is that likely to add in? How many parking spaces are available, you know, that Stuart House can provide? Because Stuart House is a place with 50 apartments in plus, I think. So I'm very concerned that this will just massively add to parking pressure in the area. I'm very concerned about the potential of issues if this HMO is not adequately managed. I'm not saying that this will happen automatically, but there are similar establishments in that area of town which are managed for part of the day, and there have been significant issues with antisocial behaviour. And we all know that the pressure that the police are under, and they're overstretched. I won't go into why, but they are. And that is something that residents are well aware of. And that is where the concerns are coming from. In terms of the potential of rejecting the application, I understand that there was a similar application in Blackburn Road, I think, that was turned down. So I would be interested to know why that decision was made. And if anyone, if officers have any insight into what was the issue with that application, does it differ from this one? Then I'd be just interested to know that as background. But at the moment, I'm very, very concerned about this, and at the moment, I would oppose the conversion. My main questions are where is the parking going to go? What is the management going to be like of the establishment? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mark. And just a matter of interest, I live just across the river from there on Causton Road, and being the member of the Neighbourhood Watch, I run a Neighbourhood Watch scheme around the area. I have reported quite a few of areas that Mark is aware of, as my ward councillor, and we have dealt with them. But having said that, the HMO, we don't know who's going to go and live there. It's unfair to assume it's going to be ex-drug addicts or drug addicts, criminals, all that sort of thing. We had a similar concern in another application in Wimpole Road, and HM was opposed. It was called in. That turned out it was going to be let out to medical staff at the hospital. So you don't know who actually going to go in there. I just thought I mentioned that we can't prejudge everything like that. That's not a planning consideration. Chris, over to you through that. I did notice in the report that we haven't actually proposed given a transport package where we have free bus service for residents and such. That might be one way of elevating that. We don't want cars down there. Yeah. So over to you, Chris.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Just on that last point, we could have a condition for that. There is a condition in there which says there's condition 10. Development should not be occupied until such time as details of public transport facilities, taxis, timetables, location of bus stop, etc. displayed. So would you want something more than that, or is that what you're anticipating? That's one point. The other points made, I think you covered the anti-social behaviour aspect in that we don't know who is going to go in there. Environmental protection have raised objections on those grounds, but there is environmental protection legislation that can take action in that respect. In addition, we may well potentially be advised to add a management condition where the details of how the HMO is managed is submitted to us for agreement. There is a manager's sort of store area as such, but I'm not aware that someone's going to sort of be there to manage it, regularly or live on site. It doesn't seem to be that is the case. So we could add in a condition to seek details of that to our satisfaction.
That'd be quite good, because I think the residents would be happy if they had a contact that they could call if anything did happen, that they had someone to call to report issues to, and then they could be dealt with. And if they weren't dealt with, then obviously they could be reported to the council and we would deal with it.
Yes, I think that'll be a good idea to add in the condition. Just looking at the points. As I said, the Highway Authority have got no objections. There are only 3 spaces guaranteed on site. We can't guarantee any other available, including at Stewart House. I'm not aware of any proposal to use that area for parking. The colleague I'm presenting this case for has not indicated there would be any parking elsewhere, and he's basing his judgment, and we base our judgment on the fact that it's a sustainable location and that people have got the opportunity to walk, to use public transport. There will be cycling provision, so we are happy with that level of parking provision, but don't expect there to be any more available in terms of considering our recommendation. I think that probably covers what was said. If there's anything else to cover, then I can do. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Chris. Simon wants to cover it.
Thank you, Chair. I was just going to suggest that as an addition to condition 10, you could request membership of the Colchester Travel Plan Club, and that could be added to the list of developer obligations for the legal agreement, if you felt that was appropriate. With regards to the issue that Councillor Gocher raised about the shared kitchens, obviously the fact that it has shared kitchens is why it's an HMO, not self-contained apartments. That is normal within an HMO, and the number of kitchens and their size has been confirmed as acceptable by our private sector housing team, who has confirmed that the overall proposals in terms of how the building would be partitioned does accord with the Essex-wide licensing standards. Each room would have 2 external windows and would be well lit. So hopefully that will allay fears about cramming. All of the rooms meet with the nationally prescribed space standards, and therefore hopefully there is no suggestion of undue cramped living conditions for residents. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Pearson.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I'm not declaring an interest because I don't really have an interest, but I should say that I know this building intimately, having until recently worked for the probation service and for about half a dozen years being the senior probation officer on site. It has its benefits, it has its downsides as a building. I'd take umbrage with the comments that police and ambulance services were frequently called to the site, because that was a very rare occurrence, in fact, when I was managing on site. And I think we need to be mindful that antisocial behaviour may be of concern to local residents, but in all the time that I was managing on site, there were never any issues with antisocial behaviour from individuals who are actually subject to current orders of the court. All of those who were visiting that property at the time were. That said, I don't think any of that is material when it comes to our decision this evening about whether or not to grant planning permission for what's in front of us. And I think that there are some benefits to doing so. Car parking, the Stuart House car park was used by members of staff when I worked in that office, so there's certainly space in that car park across the road as additional space should people wish to pay for it, because there is a cost. The spaces that are there were always or were invariably used by local residents on Saturdays and Sundays when the probation office wasn't active. So I'm sure that some of the residents will be anxious that those spaces will no longer be available. But I don't see, given what you're suggesting and Mr. Keynes has just suggested about public transport condition, and I would suggest that we do, or I would actually move that we do have that as one of the conditions. I don't see that that's an issue for us to be concerned about. The accessibility that's referred to in the report intrigues me, because I know that in all the time I worked in that office and until probation left that building about 3.5 to 4 years ago, there was a working lift that went between all 3 floors. So I'm intrigued as to where that lift is and whether that lift is still in situ, why it can't be incorporated into the development. But I think that's something that I would probably want our officers just to go back and test, because if we can make it more accessible to the building, then why not? The final matter that I just wanted to raise is, I know there is reference to a report on asbestos contamination. I know from my time there that there was an asbestos site assessment done, and there is asbestos in that building. It was contained asbestos, so there were no concerns about people working in the site. But once you start building and redeveloping the internals, then that asbestos does become an issue. And my understanding, if I remember rightly, was that some of that asbestos in the stairway as well. So, so certainly that's something that I think we need to ensure that our officers are mindful of when overseeing what goes on in the future. But that said, I would recommend that I would move that we follow the recommendation that's in front of us with the additional conditions around a management condition and the public transportation condition that's been suggested to us.
And you mentioned asbestos. Would you make that another condition as well, that the building has to be clear
I
of
think so, Chair.
asbestos before any work is undertaken?
I think made or ensured that it's safe, because we need to be mindful that not all asbestos has to be removed. It just has to be in a safe, stable situation.
Chris, is that acceptable as a condition or conditions?
Yes, Chairman, I think what we would request is that we are given the authority to either apply an informative or conditions as deemed appropriate in further discussion with environmental protection and the applicant, basically. So we would like that sort of flexibility. Some of the contamination conditions can be very onerous, but we obviously need to make things safe in terms of asbestos. So the most appropriate way we can do that, I think.
Okay, Chris,
I'm happy to go along with Chris's suggestion.
and that's a proposal, is it?
Yeah.
Is that seconded by anybody? We'll go for Helen.
Yeah.
Helen is a seconder for that. Movement of speakers, councillor Warnes.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, relating to paragraph 12, accessibility. I note the comments that councillor Pearson has made, and that therefore that suggests that that there is the provision for us to condition wider accessibility for wheelchair users, obviously dependent on the lift, etc., but nevertheless, I think paragraph 12 clearly sets out a wish to want to condition for accessibility standards for those that have mobility conditions. What isn't mentioned is whether there is therefore a need to condition for disabled parking. Because whilst I accept this is in a highly sustainable location, and we obviously would prefer people to have alternative means of actually moving around other than needing a car and car parking spaces that go with it, this may not be an option for somebody that has restricted mobility and might need disabled parking spaces, and that is silent in paragraph 12. So I wondered whether we could address whether there is a need to actually condition disabled parking as well as conditioning accessibility to people that may have mobility issues. Thank you.
Chris, is that possible or moderation?
Yes, we think we could add a condition to provide one car parking space for the disabled. I think that would be reasonable.
Right. Yes, that sounds good. The councillor wants to have a look, councillor?
That's fine. Do you need me to propose that, or is it just accepted?
No, we'll add that on the condition.
Okay,
Of the
thank
one
you.
you've already proposed. Thank you. Councillor Manning.
Thank you, Chair. I noticed that there's no recreational space within the building. Now, I take the point regarding the Castle Park is close by, which is great. However, if it's chucking it down with rain or chucking it down with snow, the two people, the rooms which have two people in them, if they're stuck in there for a whole day on top of each other, with no recreational space to go out somewhere away from each other and read or quietly, go into a room quietly, it's going to be a little bit claustrophobic. I mean, I know, how this is, and I take the point about, when you're in student days. I mean, I was there and I used to get fed up with it at times, but you live with it. But people, when they get older, do not want student accommodation, I'm afraid. And this does sound a bit like student accommodation. So I just wondered how that's going to be dealt with. Thank you, Chair.
I think it's in the nature of HMOs, but and people run it. People will phone up and they want a room to stay in for 6 months. They've got a job here. They can't afford a flat, and they will stay in a single room as such and just work. And they'll know the conditions that they will put up with. They're not being put in there. Some people are actually choosing to live like that in a room and does that. So having a snooker room and everything else in there, I don't think it's probably not going to happen because it's in the nature of HMOs, I'm afraid. Well, I get your point as such, but we can't. Can we not do this? Can we?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, this scheme does meet with our licensing standards. So given that it meets with our relevant adopted standards in Essex, I think there would have to be a change to the adopted standards for us to insist on it. And we have no objection from our private sector housing colleagues. So I don't think we regrettably have any grounds, although I think it's a lovely aspiration.
Absolutely as well. So we have a proposal. Any other speakers before we start? We have a proposal from Councillor Pearson with all the conditions that we've made a note of. A second of Helen. So can we now move to the vote that we accept the recommendation with all the conditions attached in there? So who voted?
4, Chair.
I was voting for, yeah, sorry.
1, 2, 3. That's unanimous, Chair.
Thank you very much. And that concludes that application. Now, before we go, yeah, and now thank you very much for turning up. By the way, if you wish to go, you can do so. We just got one final bit of business, and that's to pay tribute to long-standing members of this committee and the council. Councillor Helen Chow and Councillor Nigel Chapman are both retiring this May, leaving the council. Nigel, I think, has done 140 years. Nigel has done 40 odd years in the council, served an awful lot of committees all over the place. I served with him on Foxborough Homes. He was a very good chair of that organisation. We learned a lot. He's been on planning. He's very cool, calm and collected. I think we'll miss that. Fair and honest. We will do. And the same as Helen. Wonderful curries and food and advice that we did. Helen was very good, especially when I joined the planning committee. She was very useful with advice and was helping all new members. And it's been a pleasure to serve with both of you on the council. And the council will be sorely worse place off for it, I believe. And I hope everybody else agrees with that. If anyone else is wishing to say anything, please I'll go now. I wish you best all for the future. Enjoy your retirement. Don't make you come back. You can come back and you're raw and all. Surely. And thanks very much to Helen. Helen's got a tough job. She has to live with Mike. Thanks for all you've done. Thanks for what you've done for the planning committee and wish you well for the future. Thank you. And that concludes tonight's meeting. Thanks very much, everybody, for turning up.